Thank you very much for having me. I sort of hacked myself into the conference, actually.
It's all about hacking. So
I sent an email, hey, you can't have this conference without having me. But, you know, actually now having followed the conference until now, you could well have done without me.
Thank you.
So, I think we've heard all the important ingredients. And I present myself as kind of a Fab Lab hacker and researcher, but, you know, as Rico introduced himself as a professor, I probably should do that as well. I've got like 4 years assignment as a research professor at Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences, which is both pleasure and burden. You probably would agree with that. Right, state of play in OSH, open source hardware, is the title I've chosen for my talk this afternoon. I would like to try to sort of systematize some of the insights we've been talking about today, but let me first sort of try technology. Yes, there we go. Go a little bit back in history and look at when did open source really appear in hardware. And we probably would, in days of internet, go back to something like 1993 with the radioamateurs, who were really the first ones in our times to use open source when developing technology. There's a whole list of other events that happened during the past years. But if we dive a bit more into history, we or colleagues have found that actually in the 19th century, a lot of knowledge sharing between innovators really was common and not the exception as it is today. And they argue that key technologies at the heart of industrialization, high pressure steam engines, iron and steel production techniques, steamboats, textile machinery, airplanes, were at the very beginning open source endeavors, until somebody invented the patent system and implemented the patent system, which immediately killed open source innovation. So that leads me to my first chapter in the state of play of open source hardware, the legal chapter. If you look at what's in legal, I take two bits out of this whole intellectual property story. There are more to it. But initially there were two things: beautiful things and useful things. And the legal system added protection for beautiful things, we call that copyright, and it added protection for useful things, which you call patents. Those mechanisms initially give inventors and creators a sort of monopoly for a certain amount of time to exclusively make use of their art or invention. Without going into the details of that development, suddenly software arrives, and software in the first instance was neither beautiful nor useful. at least for the legal people. So they struggled a little bit how to protect that, and initially they decided code is poetry. So software is beautiful, which I would agree with. But that then meant that software fell under the protection of copyright, which annoyed a few people, amongst them Richard Stallman, who invented a trick to hack the copyright system to make software free. You know about the GPL. I'm leaving out the part of the software patents for the moment, as we are in Europe and we don't have software patents. Thanks God. Or our legislators. But then came the artists and said, hey, hang on, if the coders can set their code free, we might want to set our art free. And they then invented Creative Commons. And then came, I'm simplifying a little bit, and then came the hardware people and said, oh, if artists can make their stuff free, we want to make our stuff free as well. And started to use Creative Commons licenses on hardware, which is kind of logical, but not in a legal sense. Because The software part of hardware, yes, is art, is copyright, is Creative Commons, but the hardware part is not. So then came along legal scholars and said, yes, you can use Creative Commons licenses if you promise people not to patent your invention, then you're fine. And then came along a bunch of other people inventing all sorts of open source hardware licenses. Like the people at CERN, like the people at the Open Source Hardware Association. But in general, we've got the problem that the legal system is a mess, and the licensing system is a mess. There are some reports that have found that, yes, the patent system is a mess in the way it's used. You know, when you write a patent, initially you would describe your invention and then get protection on that invention. Today, you invent something and then you describe it in a way that almost nobody can replicate it. And then you pretend that your invention essentially covers the whole world and everything you can ever invent. And then you file a patent. So, and there's other stuff. So, the lawmaking people have become aware of that situation and are starting to fix it. Not sure if they really will be able to really correct all the problems, because there's another issue here. A lot of IP protection has been built into international agreements like the TRIPS, like the ACTA stuff, like free trade agreements, and many other areas, where yes, you can sort of try to change one bit of the law or introduce some other extra market mechanisms in IP, but it probably will be hard to fix the whole system. But my vision would be that in a very far future, we might come to think about and argue about and eventually make laws about IP protection and open source that are much more in harmony. So that was one issue with open source hardware. There are, of course, practical issues. One is this open source sharing and open contribution, and Rachel, you alluded exactly to that issue. It's a problem that, you know, when you naively think about open source, you probably not think about those two dimensions in open source, and that you really have to play on both dimensions. Another thing is easily to be seen with all those 3D printers that eventually go back to the riprap. And you see it in Linux, you see it in many other open source projects. They start at one point, and then you get forks and forks and forks and forks, and it gets massively complicated to sort of understand the whole ecosystem. And this whole ecosystem is partly talking to each other. Certainly with the riprap there is some kind of communality, but there are lots of things that are completely disconnected, and in that sense not exactly contributing back to the whole. Another practical issue touched on before, this whole question of documentation. Okay, there was this idea, let's create a shared platform for open source hardware documentation. It was a documentation jam in the US, and then you go to their Twitter account and it falls silent after just the event was over. Then somebody a year later asking, hey guys, what's going on? And then you find, oh yes, check DreamUps or no, to sort of find the continuation, what was started there. Again, this is an issue of connecting the dots. There's another issue in open source, a practical issue, and we've seen that just happening with the Heartbleed. And some people very hard try to present the Heartbleed failure as a general failure of open source and why you shouldn't do open source. But in Mashable, Christina Warren argued that it actually was an issue of under-resourcing an essential infrastructure open source project. OpenSSL, running on 66% of all web servers, has just one full-time employee to actually support a project. And I believe that's, at your end, certainly an issue, and You were there in the back with the Ultimaker. Certainly, the resources that you need to support an open source infrastructure when user scaling up is a very important practical concern. Looking at the third element, that's business. When engineers think about realizing a product, they think pretty much in one dimension. And I think Alexandra sort of touched on this subject this morning in the opening presentation. There are more things, more aspects to a product than just that piece of particular software you develop. Because you're sort of giving your piece of technology into a whole ecosystem, into a whole community, into an environment where people are there with certain expectations. And you really should get prepared to, there are supposed to be two tiny arrows which you cannot see, to look into all those other aspects. There are a couple of other business issues which I'm not going in very depth at this moment. One is the issues of platforms and the question of lock-in and compatibility. For business reasons, you want to lock in your customers as much as you can, so they don't go away. But that means, A, you're trying to be not compatible with other platforms, and that was basically the big struggle that Microsoft had when they noticed, oh, there is this animal of open source coming up, which is a big danger in business thinking. And of course, the other issue with platforms is that you basically create another middleman, which is sort of, hey, we're thinking open source, we don't need middlemen anymore. And if this middleman dies or goes down or is bought up, we heard this morning as well, bought up and then shut down, this whole nicely growing ecosystem is rendered dead immediately. And there's a third issue, which has come up also quite recently in one example, the 3D robotics DIY drones, the combination of hardware and software. Sheard has told about all the clones that appeared. So they could have thought, well, you know, we implement a little trick in our hardware. They didn't, thankfully they didn't. We implement a little trick, like 3D robotics did, that you only can upload open source software to our open source hardware if one particular certificate matches, and we control to whom we give that certificate. Which is again sort of a locking in, locking out mechanism, which is totally contrary to the ideas of open source, but comes from an urgent business need to protect what you're doing in that moment. This is just another example, really going back to that technology-driven approach. Mathilde Bertrand, she produces that blog, Making Society, gives us 10 steps for creating a hardware company. And if you look through these 10 steps, there's no customer involved. Maybe at the shipping stage, at the very end. Which is kind of, yes, I'm obsessed with that tech thing. That's okay, but please get your friends to, and you might have friends who have dealt with design thinking, which is called, it's basically common sense. You try to understand your audience, and only then you start to develop your products. And you go back to your audience to actually test your prototype. Which then means, yes, we're talking about technology, and technology is important and is interesting. We love technology. We need to do business, but we need to involve people as well. And I think that was one of the messages of Alexandra this morning as well. The world is not only populated by white men, but, you know, white men might be a bit more vocal, so the question for me really is, what can we do about that? How can we change our society actually to deal with that issue? I believe that against all odds, open source hardware has a future if we arrive at not only think about conventional goods and services, but also think about societal values and how we can integrate the societal values in our business endeavors. Secondly, we need to find a way to deal with that dispersion and this growing number of clones and variations and the dots not talking to each other. I mean, we need to find mechanisms to reconnect the dots and then to connect the systems of connected dots to each other. And then I believe we really have to think about the legal system and get into, it's a bad word, but get into lobbying, work in that system to see how we can fix that as well. Not only in the interest of open source, but also in the interest of those guys who still believe in IP and want to deal with IP and have beautiful business models out there, some of them, using IP. That's it from me. Thank you.